When overseer Silas Burke disappeared from Middleton Plantation on a humid August night in 1838, the search parties scoured the swamps and back roads of South Carolina for weeks. They never found a body, never found a trace, never thought to question the quiet laundress who continued washing the master's linens with the same steady efficiency she had shown for 12 years. Patience Wright had spent those years learning the properties of lye, the caustic solution that made fabric pristine white. What the plantation owners never realized was that the same knowledge that removed bloodstains could also remove evidence of far greater crimes. By the time anyone suspected the truth, Patience had vanished into the Underground Railroad, leaving behind only whispers of the washwoman who made men disappear. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. There are moments in every oppressed life when survival instinct transforms into something harder and more dangerous. For Patience Wright, that transformation began on a sweltering June afternoon in 1838, when she witnessed Overseer Burke beat a 12-year-old boy unconscious for the crime of taking water during fieldwork without permission. The child survived, but barely, and something in Patience died that day, replaced by cold calculation. She had endured her own suffering with the patience her name suggested, accepting cruelty as the price of staying alive. But watching that child's blood soak into Carolina dirt while Burke laughed created a fury she could no longer contain. The decision crystallized in that moment, though she would spend 2 more months planning with meticulous care. When Burke finally entered her laundry house on that August night, he was walking toward a reckoning 7 years in the making, orchestrated by a woman whose quiet demeanor had hidden depths of rage he never suspected existed. The year was 1838, and Middleton Plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of South Carolina low country, where cotton grew in fields that seemed to extend forever under skies heavy with humidity and heat. The plantation house stood white and imposing at the end of a long drive lined with ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, a monument to wealth built entirely on the labor of 147 enslaved souls who worked from dawn until darkness claimed the fields. Master Thomas Middleton had inherited this empire from his father, along with the conviction that slavery was not merely economically necessary, but divinely ordained, a belief he expressed frequently from the family pew at Sunday services. Patience Wright had been born on this plantation 34 years earlier, her first breath drawn in the cramped quarters behind the big house where domestic workers lived in conditions that would have shocked anyone who believed the myth of benevolent slavery. Her mother, Ruth, had worked in the laundry house before her, spending 20 years bent over washing barrels until her back became permanently curved and her hands so scarred from lye burns that she could barely hold a spoon. Ruth had died when Patience was 16, collapsing beside a steaming barrel on a day when the temperature exceeded 100 degrees and the humidity made breathing feel like drowning. Patience had taken her mother's place immediately, inheriting not just the position, but also the knowledge Ruth had accumulated through decades of painful experience. The laundry house stood separate from the main buildings, a wooden structure with a tin roof that amplified the heat until the interior felt like the inside of an oven. Inside were massive wooden barrels for washing, iron cauldrons for heating water, and shelves lined with supplies that included the wood ash used to make lye. The work was brutal and dangerous, requiring constant contact with caustic chemicals that could strip skin from bone if handled carelessly. Making lye required burning hardwood until only ash remained, then combining that ash with water in carefully measured proportions. The resulting solution was powerfully alkaline, capable of breaking down organic matter with ruthless efficiency. When applied to fabric, it dissolved grease and blood, destroyed bacteria, and bleached away stains until cloth emerged pristine and white. The same properties that made lye invaluable for laundry also made it extremely dangerous to handle. Patience's hands bore countless scars from the times the solution had splashed on her skin, eating through flesh with a burning sensation that haunted her dreams. but those scars represented education as much as injury. Each burn had taught her something about concentration and reaction time, about how quickly lie could work and how thoroughly it could destroy. She learned to judge the strength of her solutions by color and viscosity, understanding instinctively when she had created something powerful enough to dissolve the toughest stains, or when she needed to add more ash to increase potency. Over 12 years, Patience had become an expert in chemistry without ever attending school or reading a scientific text, her knowledge written in pain across her damaged hands. The plantation's white women praised her skill constantly, bringing her their most difficult cleaning challenges and marveling at how she could make blood vanish completely from white fabric. They would comment on her gentle demeanor and quiet nature, congratulating themselves on owning such a valuable and tractable worker. What they never understood was that Patience's quietness was armor, a protective shell that hid everything she truly thought and felt from people who believed they had the right to own her very soul. Patience had learned early that intelligence was dangerous for enslaved people to display. Masters feared educated slaves, worried that knowledge would inspire rebellion or make escape more likely. So Patience had become expert at appearing simple, at keeping her eyes downcast and her responses brief, at laughing when expected and remaining silent when white people discussed matters they assumed she couldn't understand. But behind that mask of subservience, her mind worked constantly, observing and calculating, storing information that might someday prove useful. The other enslaved people at Middleton recognized the intelligence that Patience hid from their captors. In the quarters at night, when white overseers were distant enough that whispered conversations carried little risk, the community would share knowledge and strategies for survival. Patience learned which wild plants could be eaten safely and which were deadly poison. She discovered which sections of the nearby swamp were deep enough to hide things that should never be found. She memorized the patterns of patrol routes and the schedules of white overseers who enforced the plantation's brutal discipline. This collective wisdom, passed down through generations who survived by understanding their environment better than their captors, gave Patience resources that extended far beyond her own experience. The elderly woman everyone called Aunt Sarah, who had been enslaved for more than 60 years, taught her how to identify medicinal herbs by moonlight. The plantation cook, a woman named Hannah, explained which foods could mask bitter tastes and which combinations might cause illness if prepared improperly. The field workers described the locations of abandoned structures and hidden paths through the woods that could provide escape routes if running ever became necessary. Patience absorbed all of this information like a sponge, understanding that knowledge was the only form of power available to people who owned nothing, not even themselves. She never knew when some piece of information might become crucial, so she remembered everything, storing facts away like precious coins against a day when she might need to spend them. Overseer Silas Burke had arrived at Middleton Plantation in the spring of 1831, riding in on a black horse with a reputation for cruelty that preceded him like smoke from a house fire. Burke was a tall man with pale eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, assessing their worth and finding them wanting. He came from Georgia, where he had worked several plantations before being quietly dismissed under circumstances that were never fully explained, but involved a young enslaved woman who had tried to drown herself rather than endure his attention any longer. Master Middleton had hired Burke specifically for his reputation as a harsh disciplinarian, believing that the plantation's productivity could be increased through stricter oversight and more severe punishments for any perceived infractions. Burke exceeded those expectations in ways that made even hardened overseers uncomfortable. He carried a whip that he had braided himself from raw leather, and he used it with a precision that suggested years of practice. But unlike some overseers who whipped out of anger or drunkenness, Burke seemed to approach punishment as a science, calibrating his violence to cause maximum pain while avoiding damage that would reduce a worker's economic value. What made Burke particularly dangerous was his unpredictability. Other overseers followed consistent patterns, making it possible to anticipate their movements and avoid their attention. But Burke would appear without warning in fields or quarters, catching people in moments of rest they thought were safe. He took particular pleasure in targeting those who showed intelligence or dignity, as if their quiet strength threatened his authority. Several men had been sold away after Burke accused them of plotting rebellion, charges that were almost certainly false, but which Master Middleton accepted without question. From the moment Burke arrived, patients understood that he represented a threat different from the ordinary cruelties of plantation life. The way his eyes followed her when she carried laundry to the big house, the comments he made that walked the edge between observation and threat, the casual ways he would find reasons to visit the laundry house when she was working alone, all of it telegraphed danger that made her skin crawl with instinctive fear. She dealt with his attention the way she dealt with all threats, by becoming even more invisible, even more subservient, giving him no excuse to escalate from verbal harassment to physical violence. For 7 years, this strategy worked well enough to keep her relatively safe, though the constant vigilance required was exhausting in ways that left scars deeper than any whip could cut. Patients lived in a state of perpetual alertness, always aware of Burke's location, always calculating escape routes, always preparing responses to potential confrontations. The other enslaved women at Middleton understood what patients endured, because most of them faced similar threats from white men who believed that ownership of a person's labor included ownership of their body. They developed strategies to protect each other, working in pairs when possible, creating systems of warnings and lookouts that provided some measure of safety. But those protections had limits, and everyone knew that ultimately each woman faced her oppressor alone. The summer of 1838 brought weather that seemed designed to test human endurance. Temperatures exceeded 95 degrees for weeks at a time, and the humidity made the air feel thick enough to chew. In the fields, enslaved workers labored under conditions that killed several people from heat exhaustion and dehydration. In the laundry house, patients worked in temperatures that climbed even higher, the steam from her washing barrels combining with the summer heat to create an environment that felt like punishment itself. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-June, Patience was carrying a basket of clean linens across the yard between the laundry house and the main residence when she heard shouting from the cotton fields. She set down her basket and moved toward the disturbance along with several other people from the quarters, all of them drawn by the particular quality of the screams that suggested something terrible was happening. What she saw when she reached the field would haunt her for the rest of her life and transform everything that came after. A child named Samuel, just 12 years old and small for his age, lay on the ground, while Overseer Burke stood over him with his whip. The boy's back was already striped with blood from multiple blows. The other field workers stood frozen in a semicircle around the scene, their faces masks of horror and helplessness as they watched Burke raise his arm for another strike. Samuel had committed the unforgivable crime of pausing to drink water from the bucket at the end of the row without waiting for the designated water break that came every 2 hours. The temperature that afternoon had reached 103 degrees, and the child had been working since sunrise. His request for water was an act of desperate thirst rather than defiance, but Burke treated it as rebellion that required brutal correction. Patience arrived in time to see Burke bring the whip down across Samuel's shoulders with enough force that the sound echoed across the field like a gunshot. The boy's scream cut off abruptly as consciousness left him, his small body going limp in the dirt. Burke stood over him for a long moment, breathing heavily from exertion, his face flushed with heat and something darker that Patience recognized as pleasure. He had enjoyed this, taken satisfaction from breaking a child's body as punishment for the crime of being thirsty. "Let that be a lesson," Burke announced to the assembled workers, his voice carrying across the field with practiced projection. "Water breaks come when I say they come. Not when you decide you're thirsty. This boy will remember that, assuming he lives. If he doesn't, well, That's one less mouth for Master Middleton to feed. The casual dismissal of a child's potential death, spoken as if discussing the weather, made something shift deep in Patience's chest. She had witnessed countless acts of cruelty over her 34 years, had endured her own share of violence and degradation, but this felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the child's age, or the unnecessary brutality of the punishment, or simply that this particular moment arrived when Patience's capacity to absorb injustice had finally reached its limit. Two of the field workers carried Samuel back to the quarters, where the plantation's unofficial healer, Aunt Sarah, worked through the night to keep him alive. The boy survived, though the scars on his back would remain for the rest of his life, and the beating left him with injuries that would affect his ability to work in ways that made his future uncertain. Burke showed no remorse and faced no consequences for actions that had nearly killed a child. Master Middleton, when informed of the incident, responded by praising Burke's firm hand and suggesting that perhaps the other workers would be more obedient now that they understood the price of defiance. Patience returned to the laundry house that evening and continued her work with mechanical efficiency, her hands performing familiar tasks, while her mind traveled dark paths it had never fully explored before. She had always accepted that survival required endurance, that enslaved people had no recourse against the violence of their captors except to survive it and hope for eventual escape or the unlikely possibility of freedom. But watching Samuel's blood soak into South Carolina dirt, while Burke laughed, had created something new inside her, a cold rage that felt different from the helpless anger she had experienced countless times before. This anger had clarity and purpose. It transformed her from someone who endured into someone who could act. The decision crystallized over the following days as she watched Samuel struggle to heal from injuries that should never have been inflicted. Patience understood with absolute certainty that Burke would continue hurting people, that his cruelty would escalate rather than diminish, and that waiting for divine justice or earthly intervention was a fantasy that would cost more lives. If Burke was going to be stopped, she would have to stop him herself. The realization brought fear, but also strange calm. Once the decision was made, Patience could focus on planning rather than wrestling with moral questions that had no good answers in a system designed to crush morality itself. She began observing Burke's patterns with new attention, noting when he made his rounds, where he went when not supervising field work, and most importantly, when he was likely to be alone and vulnerable. She reviewed everything she knew about lie and its properties, considering possibilities she had never allowed herself to contemplate before. The chemistry of what she was planning was straightforward. Lie was sodium hydroxide, a substance powerfully alkaline enough to break down organic matter through a process called saponification. When applied to fabric, it dissolved fats and proteins, destroyed bacteria, and bleached away stains. When applied to human tissue, it did exactly the same thing, eating through flesh with ruthless efficiency. Concentrated lye solutions could cause severe burns on contact, but given enough time and proper conditions, they could do far more than damage they could eliminate entirely. Patience had witnessed the effects of lye countless times in her 12 years of laundry work. She had seen how quickly it could eat through fabric if concentrations were too strong or contact time too long. She had treated burns on her own hands and observed how the chemical attacked flesh, breaking it down at a molecular level. She understood intuitively what chemistry textbooks explained in technical language, that given sufficient concentration and time, lye could reduce organic matter to its component parts, leaving nothing recognizable behind. What she needed was opportunity, a moment when Burke would be alone in a place where she could act without immediate discovery. The laundry house seemed the obvious choice, as it was her domain where she worked alone most days, and where large barrels of lye solution were always present. But getting Burke there without suspicion would require manipulation more subtle than simply inviting him. She needed him to come of his own volition, believing he was in control of the situation right up until the moment when control shifted irreversibly. The opportunity came in early August, though Patience had to create it rather than simply waiting for circumstances to align. She began altering her behavior in small ways, calculated to attract Burke's attention. Instead of avoiding his gaze as she usually did, she would meet his eyes briefly before looking away, a gesture that could be interpreted as invitation by a man predisposed to see enslaved women as available for his pleasure. She adjusted her route when carrying laundry so that she would encounter him more frequently, always acting as if these meetings were accidental rather than planned. Burke noticed the changes, as she had known he would. Men like him were always watching for signs that their targets might be receptive to advances, interpreting any deviation from complete rejection as encouragement. He began finding more reasons to visit the laundry house, stopping by under pretense of checking supplies or ensuring that the master's linens were being properly maintained. Each visit lasted a little longer, and his comments became increasingly personal, testing boundaries to see how Patience would respond. She responded with carefully calibrated signals that suggested interest without explicitly confirming it, a dangerous game that required precise judgment about how far to encourage him without triggering immediate action before her preparations were complete. She needed Burke to believe that she was gradually surrendering to his attention, that given a bit more time and persuasion, she would welcome rather than resist. The performance required acting skills she had developed through years of hiding her true thoughts and feelings from people who claimed ownership of her soul. While conducting this psychological manipulation, Patience also prepared the laundry house physically for what she intended to do. She mixed lye solutions, stronger than she would normally use for washing, storing them in barrels positioned strategically around the workspace. She identified tools that could serve as weapons if needed, heavy wooden paddles used for stirring washwater, metal hooks for manipulating hot fabric, even the sharp knife she used for cutting soap. She studied the interior layout with tactical awareness, noting which areas provided cover and which offered clear paths to the door if escape became necessary. Most importantly, she prepared herself mentally for what she was planning to do. Patience understood that crossing this line would change her fundamentally, that taking a life would mark her in ways that could never be erased. She spent nights in prayer, asking forgiveness for what she intended, but finding no other path that her conscience could accept. Burke would continue hurting people unless someone stopped him, and the system that empowered him would never hold him accountable. The choice was between action and complicity, and Patience chose action, even knowing the terrible price it might require. The night of August 15th arrived with heat that had not diminished despite the sun's setting hours earlier. Humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket, making breathing difficult and coating everything with moisture that never quite evaporated. Patience was working late in the laundry house, as she often did when the day's heat made sleep difficult, and the relative solitude offered respite from the crowded quarters where she usually spent nights. She had positioned herself so that anyone approaching would see her through the open door, illuminated by candlelight that made her visible while leaving the interior shadowed. Burke arrived just after 10 o'clock, his footsteps audible on the wooden stairs that led up to the laundry house entrance. He paused in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the darkness outside, his face visible in the candlelight. "Working late, Patience," he observed, his voice carrying implications beyond the simple words. "That's dedication that deserves recognition." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the action casual but laden with significance that made the small space suddenly feel much smaller. Patience kept her hands moving through the washwater, her expression neutral despite the hammering of her heart. "Just finishing the master's shirts for tomorrow, sir," she responded quietly, using the deferential tone she had perfected over decades of enforced subservience. Wanted to make sure they were ready for the week ahead. Her eyes remained downcast, her posture suggesting submission, even as her mind calculated distances and timing with cold precision. Burke moved closer, circling around the washing barrel that stood between them. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice dropping to something more intimate, and therefore more threatening, more friendly. "I've noticed the way you look at me now, not scared like before. Maybe you're starting to understand that cooperation has benefits, that things could be easier for you if you're smart about it." His hand reached toward her face, fingers intending to lift her chin and force eye contact that she had been carefully avoiding. That touch was the trigger Patience had been waiting for, the moment when Burke's attention would be focused entirely on anticipated conquest rather than potential danger. Her hand, still submerged in the washing barrel, closed around the wooden paddle she had positioned there earlier. In one fluid motion born from 12 years of handling heavy tools in tight spaces, she pulled the paddle from the water and swung it with all the strength her work-hardened arms could generate. The paddle connected with the side of Burke's head with a sound like splitting wood, the impact solid enough that Patience felt the vibration travel up her arms. Burke's expression shifted from predatory confidence to shock in the instant before his legs buckled and he collapsed sideways against the washing barrel. The weight of his falling body tipped the barrel, sending water cascading across the floor in a flood that soaked his clothing and spread toward the corners of the room. He tried to rise, one hand reaching for his head where blood was already flowing from the gash the paddle had opened, but his movements were uncoordinated and weak. Patience didn't hesitate. She had planned this moment for 2 months, rehearsed it mentally 100 times, understood that any pause would give Burke opportunity to recover or call for help that would end her life within minutes. She struck again, the paddle coming down on the back of his skull with force that made her shoulder ache from the impact. Burke went still, his body collapsing completely onto the wet floor, blood mixing with spilled wash water to create patterns that spread across the wooden boards like spilled ink. For several seconds, Patience stood frozen, the paddle still gripped in both hands, her breathing rapid and shallow as the reality of what she had done crashed over her in waves. She had just attacked a white overseer, a crime punishable by death in ways designed to serve as warning to other enslaved people who might consider similar rebellion. Even if Burke survived, even if he never woke to identify his attacker, the simple fact of assault would trigger investigations and punishments that would tear through the enslaved community like fire through dry brush. But Patience had known all of this before she acted. She had accepted these consequences during the long nights of planning when she decided that some things were worth dying for. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the immediate physical reality of violence, the way Burke's blood looked almost black in the candlelight, the smell of it mixing with lye and wet fabric, the strange stillness of his body that suggested he might already be beyond any possibility of recovery. She forced herself to move, to think beyond the paralysis of shock. Her plan had never depended on Burke surviving this encounter. She knelt beside his body and pressed fingers against his neck, searching for the pulse that would tell her whether she was dealing with an unconscious man or something beyond unconscious. The heartbeat was there, faint and irregular, but present. Burke was alive, which meant she needed to work quickly before he regained consciousness, or someone came looking for him. The largest washing barrel stood in the corner of the laundry house, a massive oak construction that could hold nearly 50 gallons of liquid. Patience had filled it that afternoon with water and wood ash, creating a lye solution stronger than she would normally use for any cleaning purpose. The mixture had been steeping for hours, the alkalinity increasing as the ash released its sodium hydroxide into the water. It was ready for what she had planned, though using it would require strength she wasn't certain she possessed. Patience gripped Burke under his arms and began dragging him toward the barrel. His body was dead weight, made heavier by water-soaked clothing and the complete lack of cooperation that came from unconsciousness. She pulled him across the floor inch by inch, her back screaming with effort, her breath coming in gasps that echoed in the quiet laundry house. Twice she had to stop and rest, terror rising each time that Burke might wake, or that someone might hear the sounds of struggle and come to investigate. It took nearly 15 minutes to move Burke the 20 feet to the barrel, and by the time she positioned him beside it, Patience's dress was soaked with sweat and spilled water. The next part would be even harder. The barrel was waist-high, and Burke weighed at least 200 pounds. Getting his body over the rim and into the lye solution would require leverage and determination that pushed the limits of human capability. She found a wooden crate and positioned it beside the barrel, creating a step that would give her height advantage. Then she gripped Burke's body again and began the agonizing process of lifting. His torso came up first, his head rolling back limply as she heaved him onto the edge of the barrel. For a terrible moment, she thought the barrel might tip over from unbalanced weight, but the oak construction held firm. She pushed hard against Burke's shoulders, using her own body weight to force him forward, and suddenly he was falling into the barrel with a splash that sent lye solution cascading over the sides. Patience stumbled backward, her arms trembling from exertion, and stared at what she had done. Burke's body lay submerged in the barrel, his face barely visible beneath the milky liquid. Small bubbles rose from his nose and mouth, and for a horrible moment, Patience thought he might drown before the lye could do its work. But then the bubbles stopped, and she understood that Burke had taken his final breath while unconscious, never knowing the fate that awaited him in the caustic solution that would erase him from existence. She forced herself to look away and focus on the practical necessities of covering her crime. The floor was covered with spilled water and blood, evidence that would doom her if discovered before she could clean it. Patience grabbed rags and began scrubbing, her movements mechanical and efficient despite the horror of what she was cleaning. The blood came up surprisingly easily, dissolved by the lye-tainted water that had spilled from the barrel. Within an hour, the floor looked as clean as it did after any day's work, with no visible signs of the violence that had occurred. The paddle she had used as a weapon presented more difficulty. The blood on it was obvious, and wooden grain absorbed stains in ways that made complete removal nearly impossible. Patience considered burning it, but smoke in the middle of the night would attract attention she couldn't afford. Instead, she submerged the paddle in a barrel of concentrated lye solution, knowing that given enough time, even the wood would begin to break down, and any biological evidence would be destroyed completely. Burke's horse stood tied outside the laundry house, a detail Patience had forgotten in the chaos of action, but which now presented both problem and opportunity. Leaving the horse suggested Burke was still present somewhere on the plantation, which would trigger immediate searches. But if the horse were to disappear along with its rider, it would appear that Burke had ridden away for reasons unknown, buying her time before anyone questioned his absence seriously. Patience had never been comfortable with horses, but necessity required capabilities she didn't know she possessed. She untied the animal and walked it away from the laundry house, moving through darkness toward the swamp that bordered the plantation's western edge. The horse followed docilely, unaware that it was participating in covering evidence of its master's death. When she reached the swamp's boundary, Patience removed the saddle and bridle, hiding them beneath fallen logs where they might never be found. Then she slapped the horse's flank hard, sending it running into the darkness where it would eventually be found wandering, or would disappear into the wilderness that still covered much of South Carolina's low country. By the time Patience returned to the laundry house, dawn was less than 2 hours away. Burke's body lay in the lye barrel, already beginning the chemical transformation that would make identification difficult and eventually impossible. The solution was strong enough that flesh would break down rapidly, saponifying into a gray sludge that bore no resemblance to human tissue. Within days, there would be nothing left but bones, and even those would become brittle and porous as the lye attacked their calcium structure. Patience knew she couldn't simply leave the barrel undisturbed until decomposition was complete. Other enslaved workers used the laundry house, and any of them might look into the barrel and discover what it contained. She needed to create a reason for that particular barrel to remain untouched, something that would keep people away without raising suspicions about why. She settled on a simple explanation that relied on everyone's familiarity with her work processes. Patients spread word the next morning that she was processing a particularly difficult load of stained linens using an experimental technique that required days of soaking in strong lye solution. The barrel in question should not be disturbed under any circumstances, as opening it prematurely would ruin the treatment and force her to start over. This explanation was accepted without question because Patience had established a reputation over 12 years as someone who produced exceptional results through methods that sometimes seemed unusual, but always delivered clean fabric. The first day after Burke's disappearance, no one seemed particularly concerned about his absence. Overseers occasionally rode to town on business or personal matters without informing every enslaved worker of their movements. By the second day, when Burke failed to appear for morning roll call and his horse was found wandering near the swamp without saddle or rider, Master Middleton became concerned and organized search parties to look for his missing overseer. For 3 weeks, groups of white men on horseback combed the plantation and surrounding countryside, searching for any sign of Silas Burke. They checked the slave quarters, questioned workers about whether anyone had seen Burke on the night he disappeared, and explored the swamps and woods where a man might have met accident or misfortune. Dogs were brought in to track scent, but the trail ended at the laundry house and went no further, a detail that caused some speculation but no definitive conclusions. Throughout the search, Patience continued her daily work with the same quiet efficiency she had always displayed. She washed the master's linens, cleaned the household's clothing, and maintained the laundry house exactly as she had for 12 years. The barrel containing Burke's remains sat in the corner, undisturbed and unremarked upon, except for Patience's occasional warnings to other workers that it should not be opened until her treatment process was complete. By the end of the 3rd week, Burke's body had been reduced to components that bore no resemblance to human remains. The flesh had saponified completely, breaking down into a grey-brown sludge that floated on the lye solution. The bones remained largely intact, but had become brittle and porous, their calcium structure compromised by prolonged exposure to the alkaline solution. Patience knew that she would need to dispose of these remains carefully, in ways that would prevent their ever being identified as human, even if accidentally discovered years later. She waited for a moonless night, when darkness would provide cover for work that couldn't be explained if witnessed. Using a long wooden pole, she broke the brittle bones into fragments small enough to remove from the barrel without detection. The lye had done its work so thoroughly that the bones crumbled with relatively little force, breaking into pieces that could be easily transported. She wrapped the fragments in cloth and carried them in small batches to various locations around the plantation, burying them in shallow holes that she dug near tree roots or in the corners of field boundaries where soil was regularly disturbed by plowing. The grey sludge that had been Burke's soft tissue presented different challenges. Patience couldn't simply pour it on the ground near the laundry house without creating evidence that might be discovered and investigated. Instead, she diluted it with additional water and disposed of it gradually over several days, pouring small amounts into different locations where organic waste was commonly discarded. The caustic solution killed vegetation where it touched soil, but these dead patches appeared no different from damage caused by accidental lye spills that happened regularly in laundry work. By early September, all physical evidence of Silas Burke's existence had been scattered across Middleton Plantation in fragments too small and too degraded to be recognized as human remains. The search for the missing overseer continued sporadically through the fall, but as weeks became months without discovery, the intensity diminished. Master Middleton eventually concluded that Burke must have met with misfortune in the swamps, perhaps attacked by an alligator or drowned in deep water where his body would never be recovered. Such disappearances were not unheard of in South Carolina's low country, where wilderness still held dangers that could claim lives without leaving evidence. What no one suspected was that the quiet laundress who had continued her work throughout the crisis had been responsible for Burke's vanishing. Patience had created the perfect disappearance, eliminating a man so completely that not even his bones could testify to what had happened. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, a secret that would define the rest of her life, even as it remained forever unspoken. But Patience understood that Burke's disappearance, however complete, had created a problem that required careful management. She possessed knowledge that could destroy the Middleton family's reputation and potentially lead to legal consequences if the truth ever emerged. A white overseer had been killed on their property by an enslaved woman, a fact that would shock South Carolina society and raise questions about plantation management that no slave-owning family wanted to face. This knowledge gave Patience leverage she had never possessed before, though using it would require delicacy and perfect timing. The opportunity came in late October, when Master Middleton summoned her to his study for a conversation that began with questions about Burke's final days, but evolved into something far more significant. Middleton was a shrewd man who had noticed details that troubled him, even if he couldn't quite assemble them into coherent narrative. Burke had last been seen heading toward the laundry house. His horse had been found near the swamp, but showed no signs of panic or struggle that would indicate its rider had been thrown or attacked. The trail of scent that the tracking dogs had followed ended at the laundry house and went no further, as if Burke had simply ceased to exist at that location. "You worked late that night," Middleton observed, his tone conversational, but his eyes sharp with calculation. "Did you see or hear anything unusual? Any sign of where Burke might have gone after visiting the laundry house?" The questions were phrased carefully, inviting cooperation rather than demanding it, but Patience heard the underlying threat. Middleton suspected something even if he didn't know exactly what, and he was searching for information that would either confirm or dispel his concerns. Patience had prepared for this conversation during the long weeks of disposing evidence and waiting for discovery that never came. She kept her eyes downcast and her voice steady as she responded with words chosen for their implications rather than their explicit content. "Mr. Burke did stop by that evening, sir. Wanted to check that the linens would be ready for the week. He seemed troubled about something, mentioned concerns about security and workers who might be planning mischief. After he left, I heard his horse ride away toward the west fields, but I didn't see which direction he ultimately went." The statement was carefully constructed to suggest that Burke had been worried about threats from enslaved workers, planting the seed that his disappearance might have been caused by the very people he was trying to control. It also confirmed that Patience had been among the last to see Burke alive, establishing her as a potential witness rather than a suspect. Most importantly, it was vague enough that it couldn't be proven false while specific enough to sound credible. Middleton absorbed this information with visible interest, his expression shifting as he considered possibilities that Patience's statement had introduced. "Troubled about security," he repeated slowly. "Did he mention specific concerns or name anyone he suspected of planning problems?" The question revealed that Middleton was willing to believe enslaved workers might have killed his overseer, a narrative that would be less embarrassing than admitting Burke had simply vanished without explanation. Patience allowed herself a moment of apparent hesitation before responding, as if weighing whether to share sensitive information. "He mentioned that some of the field workers had been talking after the incident with young Samuel, sir. Said there was anger that made him concerned about potential revenge. But he didn't name specific people, just said he would need to watch more carefully in the coming weeks." This addition strengthened the narrative of Burke as a victim of the people he had been hired to control, while also introducing the beating of Samuel as possible motivation for violence against the overseer. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Middleton probing for additional details and Patience providing information calculated to support the theory that Burke had been killed by field workers rather than by the domestic laundress who had actually eliminated him. By the time she left the study, Patience was confident that Middleton would focus his suspicions on others, while never seriously considering that the gentle woman who made his shirts pristine white might have committed the most perfect murder in plantation history. But Patience also understood that her knowledge about Burke's true fate gave her leverage that extended beyond deflecting suspicion. She knew what had happened to Silas Burke, knew how thoroughly he had been erased, and knew that this information would be devastating to the Middleton family if it ever became public. A whispered accusation that the master's laundress had killed his overseer and disposed of the body in the laundry house would create scandal that could destroy Middleton's reputation among his peers, regardless of whether the accusation could be proven in court. This knowledge was currency that Patience could spend, but only once and only if she spent it wisely. She had no interest in revenge against Master Middleton, who had been neither better nor worse than most plantation owners in his treatment of enslaved people. What she wanted was freedom, the legal right to control her own life and movement that slavery denied, manumission papers that would allow her to walk away from Middleton Plantation and build a life in the North where her skills as a laundress could be sold to customers she chose, rather than owners who claimed her labor as property. Over the following months, Patience began a careful campaign of subtle manipulation designed to make Middleton believe that freeing her would be in his own best interest. She never mentioned Burke directly, but she would occasionally make comments in Middleton's presence about how much she knew regarding the plantation's operations, how many secrets she had overheard during her 12 years of work, how valuable such knowledge might be to people asking questions about missing overseers. The implications were never stated explicitly, but hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Middleton was intelligent enough to understand what Patience was suggesting without her having to spell it out in ways that could be used against her. She possessed dangerous knowledge, and silencing her through violence would only ensure that knowledge spread through the enslaved community and potentially reached authorities who might investigate Burke's disappearance more thoroughly. The negotiation took 6 months of careful maneuvering, with neither party acknowledging openly what they were actually discussing. Middleton would mention abstractly that faithful service deserved reward, while Patience would respond with observations about how much she valued discretion and how little interest she had in causing problems for families that treated her fairly. Eventually, in March of 1839, Master Thomas Middleton announced his decision to grant Patience Wright her freedom as recognition for 12 years of exceptional service to the household. The manumission papers were prepared by a lawyer in Charleston, legal documents that established Patience as a free woman under South Carolina law. The official explanation was that Middleton wished to reward loyalty and skill with the greatest gift a master could bestow, an act of benevolence that would demonstrate to other plantation owners the benefits of treating valuable workers well. The enslaved community at Middleton Plantation understood that something more complex had occurred, though the exact details remained mysterious. They had watched Patience during the months after Burke's disappearance, noting her unusual calmness and the subtle shifts in how Master Middleton treated her. Whispers circulated in the quarters about the laundress who had somehow negotiated her freedom during the same period when the brutal overseer had vanished without trace. The connection seemed obvious, even if the mechanism remained unclear. Patience accepted her freedom papers on a cool April morning, standing in Middleton's study while he signed the documents that legally transformed her from property to person. His hand shook slightly as he wrote, and his eyes, when they met hers, held an expression that mingled relief and residual fear. He was glad to see her leave, glad to eliminate the threat she represented, even if that threat had never been stated explicitly. The price of her silence was freedom, and Middleton had decided that price was acceptable, given the alternatives. "You've served this household well, Patience," Middleton said formally, handing her the manumission papers that represented the legal foundation of her new existence. "I trust you'll find success in whatever endeavors you pursue as a free woman, and I trust also that you'll remember this household with appropriate discretion regarding matters that are best left in the past." The final sentence carried weight that confirmed their unspoken understanding. Patience would keep Burke's true fate secret, and in exchange, she would walk away with her freedom intact. Patience nodded respectfully, folding the precious documents and placing them in the pocket of her dress, where they would remain until she could secure them somewhere safer. "Thank you, Master Middleton. Your generosity will not be forgotten, and your trust in my discretion is well placed. Some matters are indeed best left buried where they can't trouble anyone." The choice of the word "buried" was deliberate, a final, subtle reminder of what she knew and what she would never speak about publicly. She left Middleton Plantation that same afternoon, carrying a small bundle of belongings that represented everything she owned in the world. The other enslaved people gathered to watch her departure, their faces reflecting complex emotions that ranged from joy at her freedom to sorrow at her leaving, to questions about how she had accomplished what seemed impossible. Several women embraced her wordlessly, understanding passing between them that required no verbal expression. They knew she had done something remarkable, something that had transformed her from victim to victor in ways that gave them hope for their own futures. Patience walked down the oak-lined drive that led away from the plantation, her back straight and her head high, despite the fear that trembled in her chest. Freedom was terrifying in ways that slavery had never been, because now she was responsible for her own survival without the terrible certainty of bondage to structure her days. But that terror was mixed with exhilaration unlike anything she had experienced in 35 years of life. She was walking away. She was free. And the man who had terrorized her for 7 years would never hurt anyone again. The journey north took Patience 3 months, traveling along routes established by the Underground Railroad network that helped formerly enslaved people escape to free states. She worked as a laundress in various towns along the way, her skills always in demand, and her freedom papers protecting her from being captured and returned to slavery. The papers were precious documents that she carried always, understanding that without them, she would be presumed enslaved and subject to capture by men who made their living hunting human beings for the reward money their return generated. She settled eventually in Philadelphia, a city with a substantial free black community, where her skills as a laundress commanded good wages and respect. Patience opened her own small laundry business, working for customers who paid her directly for services rendered rather than claiming ownership of her labor and person. The transformation from enslaved property to independent businesswoman was profound in ways that went beyond economics, representing a reclamation of humanity that slavery had tried to destroy. Over the following years, Patience built a life that would have seemed impossible during her decades of bondage. She married a free black carpenter named Thomas Henderson, a quiet man whose strength and kindness helped heal wounds that went deeper than physical scars. They had 3 children, all born free under Pennsylvania law, each one representing a victory against the system that had claimed their mother as property. Patience taught her children to read and write, skills she had been denied, but which she ensured they possessed from earliest childhood. She rarely spoke about her years in slavery, and she never told anyone the complete truth about what had happened to overseer Silas Burke. The secret remained locked inside her, a weight she carried alone because sharing it would endanger not just herself, but everyone who knew the story. Thomas understood that his wife had endured terrible things and had found her way to freedom through means she chose not to discuss, and he respected that silence as the price of survival in a world still hostile to black freedom. But while Patience kept the specific details secret, the broader outlines of her story spread through networks that connected free and enslaved black communities across the eastern states. Tales circulated about the laundress, who had somehow made an overseer vanish completely, who had negotiated her freedom through knowledge and leverage that terrified her master enough that he paid her to leave. The stories grew with each retelling, acquiring elements of the supernatural and the mythical, as they passed through communities hungry for examples of resistance and triumph. Some versions claimed Patience had used African magic to curse Burke, causing him to waste away to nothing over the course of weeks. Others insisted she had made a deal with spirits of the swamp who took Burke's body and left no trace of his existence. Still others spoke of her as a root woman who knew the properties of poisonous plants and had slipped Burke something that dissolved him from within. The truth, that she had used chemistry and courage to eliminate him physically, was both simpler and more remarkable than the legends. But the legends served their own purpose by giving hope to people who needed to believe that the powerless could sometimes overcome their oppressors. The story of Patience Wright became particularly popular in laundry houses throughout the South, where enslaved women would whisper about the sister who had used her knowledge of lie to free herself from tyranny. The tale served as both inspiration and warning, suggesting that the skills masters forced enslaved people to develop could be turned into weapons under the right circumstances. Young women learning laundry work would hear about Patience and understand that their knowledge had value and potential beyond simply making white folks' clothes clean. Patience lived to age 71, dying peacefully in 1875 in the Philadelphia home she had bought with money earned through her own labor. Her funeral was attended by more than 200 people, including her grown children, numerous grandchildren, and members of the free black community who had known her as a respected businesswoman and quiet pillar of their neighborhood. The eulogy praised her skill as a laundress, her devotion as a mother, and her strength in building a life of dignity after escaping the horrors of slavery. What the eulogy didn't mention was that Patience had helped dozens of other formerly enslaved people establish themselves in Philadelphia, providing work opportunities and quiet financial support to those making the difficult transition from bondage to freedom. She had used her knowledge of chemistry to teach young women skills that would support them in legitimate work, sharing information about lye and soap making that gave them economic independence. And she had occasionally offered advice to women facing threats from violent men, counsel that suggested non-lethal solutions to dangerous situations, but which always included the observation that knowledge itself could be a powerful form of protection. The golden locket that held the secret of her greatest act, if she had possessed such a thing, would have been buried with her, its mysteries laid to rest along with the woman who had turned suffering into strength and knowledge into liberation. But Patience Wright had never needed talismans or tokens to remember what she had done. The memory lived in her hands, in the scars from lye burns that marked her palms and fingers, in the steady strength that came from knowing she had once faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through intelligence and courage. Before we end, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The laundry house at Middleton Plantation stood for another 40 years after Patience's departure, continuing to serve its mundane purpose of cleaning the household's linens through seasons and decades. Eventually, it burned down during a fire in 1879, the old wooden structure consumed by flames that left nothing but a blackened foundation and scattered bricks. Local people claimed they heard strange sounds from that spot on quiet nights: the splash of water, the creak of wooden barrels, the whisper of fabric being scrubbed clean. They said the laundry house was haunted by spirits of enslaved workers who had labored there, though they never quite identified whose spirit might have reason to linger. The ruins of that foundation remain visible today for those who know where to look, a shallow depression in the earth near what was once the main plantation house. Historians who study the site find occasional fragments of pottery and metal, remnants of the tools and containers that supported the plantation's daily operations. But they find nothing that speaks to the violence that occurred there one August night in 1838, no evidence of the overseer who vanished, or the woman who engineered his disappearance so completely that not even his bones remained to tell the tale. The broader story of Middleton Plantation follows the familiar pattern of Southern estates after the Civil War economic decline, the loss of enslaved labor that had generated wealth, eventual abandonment and decay. The grand house fell into disrepair by the 1890s, its white columns crumbling and its rooms empty of the families that had once filled them with celebrations built on stolen labor. The land was subdivided and sold off, transformed from cotton plantation to small farms and eventually suburban development that erased most traces of what had existed before. But the story of Patience Wright survived, even as physical evidence disappeared, passed down through generations as a testament to resistance and the power of knowledge in hands determined to use it for liberation. Her descendants, scattered across the northern states, carried forward her legacy of strength and independence, even when they didn't know the full truth of how she had secured her freedom. They understood that their great-grandmother had been someone remarkable, someone who had transformed herself from victim to victor through means that commanded respect even in silence. In recent decades, historians have attempted to verify the legend of Patience Wright, searching through records from Middleton Plantation and interviewing descendants who might possess information about what actually happened. The historical record confirms that an enslaved laundress named Patience received manumission papers in 1839, an unusual occurrence that stood out because freed enslaved people were relatively rare in South Carolina at that time. The record also confirms that an overseer named Silas Burke disappeared from the plantation in 1838, under circumstances that were never adequately explained. His body never recovered despite extensive searching. The connection between these two events remains speculative from a strictly historical perspective, as no direct evidence links Patience to Burke's disappearance in ways that would satisfy academic standards of proof. But the circumstantial evidence is compelling, and the oral histories preserved in black communities provide detail and consistency that suggest truth underlying the legend. Whether Patience Wright actually killed Silas Burke and disposed of his body using lye chemistry, or whether the story represents a symbolic narrative about resistance and triumph, depends on which evidence one chooses to privilege. The written records that reflect only what white authorities chose to document, or the oral traditions that preserve truths which were too dangerous to write down. What remains indisputable is that Patience Wright transformed herself from enslaved laundress to free businesswoman during the exact period when the man who had terrorized her vanished without trace. She negotiated her freedom through leverage that frightened her master enough to grant manumission, and she built a life of dignity and purpose in Philadelphia that stood as living proof that enslaved people possessed intelligence, courage, and capabilities far beyond what the system of slavery acknowledged. Her story, whether literally true in every detail or symbolically true in its broader implications, continues to inspire and challenge those who encounter it. The tale of the washwoman who made men disappear remains a whispered legend in certain corners of Southern history, a story that makes people uncomfortable because it suggests that those who seemed powerless possessed the capacity to strike back in ways that could never be anticipated or prevented. It challenges the mythology of benevolent slavery by showing the violence that permeated the system and the lengths to which some people would go to escape or revenge themselves against that violence. And it celebrates knowledge as a form of resistance, demonstrating that education and understanding, even knowledge gained through forced labor, could become tools for liberation. Patience. Wright's hands, scarred and strengthened by 12 years of handling caustic chemicals, had brought those chemicals to bear against the man who represented everything she fought to escape. Those same hands had later built a business, raised free children, and helped others find their path from bondage to independence. They were hands that had known terrible things, but had refused to be defined by them, hands that had cleaned away stains both literal and metaphorical, until nothing remained but the possibility of new beginnings, written on blank fabric, not yet soiled by history's ongoing crimes.